The Sustainability Now Telesummit is honored to share audacious ideas and innovative solutions from more than 30 experts from around the globe. Learn how we can work together to shape a world that works. Here's your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome back to the Sustainability Now Telesummit, Shaping a World That Works. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce eco-innovator and visionary Dr. John Todd. John has dedicated his life and his genius to discovering and employing the genius of nature to heal the earth. He's developed brilliant biologically based strategies for the recovery of water, land, and sea, and has charted a way forward to responsible planetary stewardship. John, I am so thrilled to have you here with us today. Welcome.
It's an honor and a pleasure.
So you just came out with a new book called Healing the Earth. And you have a presentation for us that is based on that book.
And the second part, which you also now know, is that it's a manual, so that it takes away the exotic nature that many conservation scientists have given the field and just says, try it. You know, I was very influenced by an ecologist called Howard Odum, H.T. Odum, and he was outrageous in his wonderful ideas. He said, well, you know, when things get really bad, and this was in the 1970s, he was saying this, his book, Energy, Power, and Society, came out in 1972. He said, when things get bad, please remember that the earth is a bin of living spare parts. The purists just went crazy when he said that. But he was talking about something very real. I can remember not long after that talking to the poet Gary Snyder, that walking in the woods here. And we both kind of had a love for the Mediterranean world. And we were talking about it, and then we started to lament all the creatures that are no longer there, the plants and the animals that are gone, have been gone since Roman times, maybe some even before. And then we said, but we're looking at this incorrectly. You know, the Mediterranean is not the only Mediterranean climate. And then we added up parts of South America, parts of North America, parts of Australia. And then we thought of H.T. Odum's bin of spare parts and said maybe we could reassemble on some island the missing niches that may be important for the long-term survival of the region. And well, of course, we never did it, but maybe one day somebody will. And it's a lovely idea to start seeing the linkages between the Mediterranean places, because there are many of them. And you can take any biome and you can make an analogy. So this is the book that I've been talking about, Healing Earth. As I said, part memoir, part manual, and mostly, I hope, an inspiration for that whole young generation of people who are waking up right now and want to commit themselves to the planet. And I can reach those people. I would be a very happy fellow. The ecological knowledge is important because it has within it the legacy of evolution's story. In other words, when you look at a forest or a lake or a pond, you're basically seeing the current manifestation of millions, in fact, in some cases, billions of years of nature evolving, changing, experimenting, interacting. And And so ecological knowledge is, at its best, is the knowledge of the earth itself. You're looking at a problem. And that is a hole in the ground, a pit. And it's in a small town on Cape Cod. And into that pit, at the time this photograph was taken, the town was dumping its wastes from septic tanks, from small businesses, from veterinary clinics, old people's homes, et cetera, small business, you name it. And when I saw that pit, I analyzed what was in it. And it turns out that in that water that you're looking at, all of the priority pollutants of concern at the time to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, were in there. Now that pit is dug in coarse sand, as you can see in the foreground. Those wastes, when dumped in, migrate downward, and when they have finally drained out, it's filled up and another one is made. That pit is only 8 feet or so above the drinking water table of that town. So you can see that that the people, and happens all over the world, everywhere, are being threatened. Their water sources are being threatened. This now is illegal, but it wasn't a couple of decades ago. I looked at that. I absolutely freaked. Recently, a couple of friends had died to cancers and was very concerned and said, I need to design a technology that will clean that water up, and didn't really know how to do it. So I said, I'm going to use sunshine as the primary driving force for the conversion of those wastes into clean water. I'm going to start with that because that's what happened on Earth. And then I said, this technology has to be ecological. And if it's going to be ecological, that means that I have to assemble in those tanks all the 6 kingdoms of life, because only they in concert have the knowledge. No individual human being, no scientist has that knowledge. But those groups of organisms, the plants, the animals, the fungi, the protista, the eubacteria, the archaebacteria, together, they might solve my problem. So I went out and went to over a dozen different environments: salt marshes, ponds, lakes, streams, wet spots in the woods, a pig wallow on a farm, brought all the stuff back and put it in the tanks. And then in a very short period of time, the life began to proliferate. And there were 21 tanks there, and they're all connected like beads on a string. And inside the tanks, really miraculous things were happening. Each tank was different. It's as if nature was organizing itself around the strength and the type of the waste at each stage along the 10-day journey from the raw pollutants to the end of the process. And at the halfway point in the journey, the water then passed through. I made an aqueduct. It was up off the ground, and put into it plants that I knew had a water purifying capability. This happens to be the bulrush, the scirpus, and allow the water to flow through this and then back to the tanks for the second half of the water's journey. And I wanted to be able to make sure that there was no waste coming out of this system. So I brought to my aid that funny looking creature, which is an armored catfish, which basically vacuum cleans up any sludge or solid and converts it to its own self, its fish flesh. This is far enough downstream in the process that I knew the poisons had already been to a large degree removed. Then at the end, after 10 days, that's what came out. That incredible pure water. And of the heavy metals, the water met drinking water standard. They were upstream, another story. As for the toxic compounds, they had literally been snipped apart and digested by the life within the system itself. Of the 15 toxins, 14 were below any kind of detectable limit in the water. The 15th was 99.99% removed, just barely detectable. So this was a marvelous first experiment. But the problem was, really, people didn't believe me. It seemed too good to be true. So to make a long story short, the state of Massachusetts was very unhappy with me for doing this experiment. The federal EPA in Washington, the administrator sent up one of his senior people to evaluate the chemistry and what I was doing, and he said, "This is bona fide. What John has done is bona fide." But in order to prove the technology, I had to spend $8 million in external value validation, which I ended up doing. So here we are. Chemicals that are hard to get rid of, gotten rid of. A living technology, we call these things eco-machines, but they're the kind of living technologies that can be used to do so many different things. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to clean up oil spills of the heavy bunker crude oil, which is the kind of sludge from petroleum manufacturing. And it's used to power ships today, but 100 years ago, it was used to power factories in large volumes. And so in Massachusetts and Rhode Island is the Blackstone River. And the Blackstone River corridor was the birth of the industrial age in North America. And along the river, every mile, roughly, a dam was built by the earlier settlers. And the dam basically blocked the river from flowing freely to the sea. And the dams were used to power the factories. And again, as I said, there's about one every mile. And after a while, in order to move things up and down the river, they had to make canals parallel to the river. And horses would pull barges back and forth with materials going up and down from Providence, Rhode Island, up to Worcester in central Massachusetts. Then the factories, as I mentioned, were converted to bunker crude oil. And they operated for about a century. And they started to shut down after World War II. And as they shut down, the big underground cement tanks that all this oil was sitting in began to crack and break, and literally millions of gallons were going into the canals and into the groundwater of the area. Here you're looking at the canal, and you can see the heavy oil slick on it. And this is the site where we set up the experiment. This drawing, which is very complicated, is a sketch of the 4 different technologies that we combined to take water filled with oil and sludge from the bottom of the canal and bring it up and treat it. And part of the process is that the water, I should say the contaminated oil, is pumped into this structure. And on the right, you can see a whole bunch of black boxes. And that's the first place the water goes when it enters. Those black boxes are in fact filled with fungi, with polypore fungi. Those are the organisms that break down rotting wood. So when you see a dying tree, you see them on the side. And the water trickles through that and flows down. And in the process, the fine hairs of the fungi produce enzymes which start to break apart the crude oil molecules. From there, it flows into those tanks, which you've seen before. And there are 6 of them. And by the time the water and the oil gets to the 6th, it's about 95% removed. Then the final stage is that the water is pumped out and sprinkled along that floating technology, which we call a restorer. And it too has media that these plants are rooted in that has the ability to continue the process on an ongoing basis of breaking down the oil, the crude oils. And then finally, this is the floating part in the fall. It's a much bigger plant feature. But what we found happen here is absolutely remarkable. First, what we found was that the whole canal began to respond to this incubator technologies that we had that were putting good water in and organisms that like to eat oil. And so that what happened over the ensuing years is that we began to see fish life and frogs and other things coming back into the water. So much so, even though the actual water chemistry that we were doing only lasted several years because the Environmental Protection Agency grant ran out. But we could see the canal changing. It was all visual, so we kept the system going, and then we could see that downstream things were getting better. And so within the last few months, we've decided that if we can find the resources, and it would take a lot of money, we would like to clean up the whole river and the whole canal system, the 80 miles from Worcester all the way to Providence, Rhode Island, and make it into a walking corridor, a biking corridor, just turn the whole thing. And one of our associates wants to make his area, and he has some control of land, into the next, quote unquote, sustainability revolution and bring back the factories. But more importantly, to make sure that the dams are removed and that we begin to propagate the fishes that were there before the dams, you know, the salmon, the striped bass, the sturgeon, the Atlantic sturgeon, the short-nosed sturgeon, both of which are threatened with extinction. And which is depressing because they were here when the dinosaurs were here. And now so the idea is also to create a facility to basically start to bring back the fishes and to bring back the whole sense of what it must have been like, but not displace the possibility that could still be a corridor for enterprise and for human activity. Just make sure it's done correctly with full responsibility. Protecting and restoring the seas. Why don't you go to the next slide? You'll see why we need to do something about it. Every one of those red dots represents a piece of the ocean that is sick. or dying. Every one of those yellow dots represents an area of the ocean where increased nutrients are beginning to deteriorate the quality of the water and the life. And the good part of that slide is the green dots. And those are parts where the inshore oceans are being improved by efforts on behalf by human beings. So although this is a gloomy slide, it's filled with optimism. This is a typical harbor. This happens to be on Cape Cod. Now, that harbor, like most harbors, is loaded with excess nutrients and things like the eelgrasses and the bay scallops and some of the other creatures are threatened or certainly being reduced. But if you look at each one of those dots, that's a boat at a mooring or a boat at the dock. And we thought to ourselves, why can't those moorings and those docks be made into micro living technologies that clean up water? And so everywhere we have a boat, we have an eco machine, a tiny one, connected to the mooring chain. And what we did was begin in a little greenhouse in this house to develop the small technologies to then put back into the lakes and into the salt bays and so on. There's the system in the greenhouse. There are 6 tanks there, all connected, and water flows between them. And there on the surface, we have the salt marsh plants growing on rafts. And then the marine organisms, because this is salt water, growing underneath them. And what we did in order to develop the technologies, we gave our little system work. And the work that we gave it was to culture shrimp. And we figured if we could make a healthy environment for shrimp, we would be removing the contaminants that were in the water. So there's the curtain that hangs down in the water. That's colonized after the curtain was put into the sea for a couple of weeks. Marine life colonized it. We lifted it out. We put it in our greenhouse to find out if it could keep the water clean. And there are some of the creatures that are growing on it. They're the algal turfs, that little green puffs. They're the ones that are sucking up nitrogen and phosphorus and keeping the water healthy. And there is a drawing of what these little technologies would look like on a mooring of a boat. They look like little hats with the earmuffs floating down. And each one of these is based on the designs we developed in the greenhouse. This is the one thing that we don't know because we were growing shrimp, not actually measuring nutrient removal, is how effective those technologies would be on the moorings. So we designed a shoreside facility, put the technologies in the tanks, and let the water, the polluted water from the canal, from the harbor flow through these, and determine how much nitrogen was removed, and divide that by the number of micro restorers which are inside. As you can see, there are 5 inside each tank. And we would be able to calculate how many 500, how many 1,000, how many pounds would be removed. And so we could do this wherever there are boats, wherever there are docks, and protect these shoreside environments with this inexpensive way. We haven't done that experiment yet. We still hope to. Haven't found a sponsor for it, but we will. Ever since I was very young, I was very involved in boats. And I was an impossible romantic as a 9 or 10-year-old boy. And I imagined sailing around the world on my own boat and all that kind of thing. And my father was a very, very devoted to yacht design and loved all those things and had some nice boats. But what really hit me was when the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I just felt so violated by seeing those flames and that oil and the loss of life. And I said, you can't do anything about that problem right at the source where the flames and the stuff is gushing out. But the surrounding waters need to be protected from that kind of event. So began to think of a technology that could clean up millions of gallons a day of these coastal waters. But the technology not only had to be ecologically effective, it had to be powered, guess what? By the sun and by the wind. It had to be carbon neutral, or even sequester more than it emits. And so that became the idea of the Ocean Restore. It would be a sailing ship, but a sailing ship plus. Here's the original concept. This is a two-hulled craft in the back. That's an Ocean Restore. And it has a Chinese junk rig, the ancient Chinese junk rig. It's fully battened. It's suspended from the mast so that it's like a vane. It doesn't flap. And it can be easily managed. And the idea was that these sails would be made from newly developing photovoltaics, so that not only would they propel the boat with the wind, it would also propel the electric motors in the boat that also move it forward. And then down in the bottom, you can see the living technologies that we're wanting to put between the hulls in order to take the water and help purify it using all these organisms: kelp forest, algal turfs, oyster reefs, seagrass communities, and all of those. And their development has worked on a small scale, but it hasn't been developed yet at the scale we're talking about here. And so this is the view of the current proposed ship. It's 130 feet long. It's 65 feet wide. And you notice it gets a lot of its strength because it's two hulls by these structures with all the windows. And as my students pointed out to me, that's where we're going to be working as students of the sea. That's a educational ship, John, whether you know it or not. And there is the framework for the aquatic technologies between the hull that you see and that. Now, originally we planned to have it be able to be lowered right down in the water and have the full force of the waves pass through there, through the ecosystems. And the more we thought about it, no, we'd be better to elevate it above the level of the waves and use mechanical sprayers to spray the living technologies that would be purifying the oils from the water. In other words, don't use the huge drag of things in the water, but spray them. It's very much how life works at the high tide mark on a rocky, windy coast. It's splashing, and it's quite effective. We're hopeful that the engineering and design on the Ocean Restorers will begin as possibly as this year. We're optimistic, but we don't have the resources yet. We just hope to. And in which case, that means within a year or the most two, the first two of these will be built and be commissioned to do their studies and their cleanup work. This is an idea who I think is going to come to fruition, certainly in line with the little technologies that we've just seen. And the advantage of this vessel, besides being carbon neutral, is it really sends the signal that we can do work, good work, with the wind and the sun. We don't need fossil fuels for this task if we design correctly for it from the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, let's go on. We're going to walk through these. This is Appalachia. And after we go through three or four slides, I'll make a comment. It's called Mountaintop Removal, Valley Fill. Over 1 million acres of it. Extraordinarily destructive of some of the most beautiful temperate forests in the world. Next slide. And this is what it looks like when they leave. In some cases they try and remediate it. And they hydroseed these things with exotic plants and commercial fertilizers. And as you can see, when there's no soil, it doesn't work. You can see the erosion there, and it's pretty pathetic. So I decided with a graduate student to see if there is a way we could make soils. In other words, if there was a way that we could take emerging techniques, combine them into a family of techniques, and make soil where there's rock. Because if we could do that, then we could change how things are done. So the first thing we decided is that we wanted to have plants that were really tough. Their roots could go anywhere and break cracks in rocks and basically survive. And finally selected for an experiment, what we call warm season grasses. We chose a big blue stem and switchgrass and Atlantic coastal panic grass, it's called. It's very often used to stabilize sand dunes. And that would be the basis. We chose not to plant trees because scientists in Appalachia had already figured it takes 3 or 4 feet of soil to support a tree. And I knew that there isn't that much soil in the world to cover 1 million acres to 3 feet of depth. So we had to go another route. The next thing we did is we used a charcoal product called biochar, ground up fairly fine as a media to capture nutrients that are in rainwater and nutrients that are sort of in the ambient environment. We also, again, went back to our friends, the fungi. And there's a group of fungi called arbuscular fungi who have the incredible ability in the pleasant presence of plant roots to create the precursors to soil, to actually start dirt becoming soil. And we combined these, and what happened? That 2 things. The experiment was divided into 2 parts. One, the biochar fungi, the warm season perennial grasses. The other one, a one-time application of commercial fertilizer, NPK, and all the rest. So we had 2. What we found is that the big blue stem of the genus Andropogon couldn't make it. It just didn't have the ability to sit on that bedrock and make a life for itself. But the switchgrass and the Atlantic panic grass, they were able to, in association with the fungi and the biochar, make it. And initially, the first year, the plants that had the NPK were in the lead. By the end of the second year, the two treatments, one without anything other than what I just mentioned, they were producing roughly the same amount. So that we don't need to put chemicals on the land to make this work. We may need to add an extra half year or a year to the process, but we don't need to if we don't want to. Now, in the next few slides, what you're going to see, and I'm not going to take much time over them, is how we envision the landscape changing. In nature, if you start with bare soil, you then get weeds, and then eventually you get grasses coming in, and then eventually kind of woody plants, and then shrubs, and finally trees, and then it eventually, after 25 or 30 years, can become a forest if there's sufficient rain. And that process called succession is one of the most powerful allies that we could possibly imagine in regreening the planet, where one set of organisms set the stage for the next set, that set the stage for the next set. So in these slides, you'll see over a period of, I think it's 16 years, how the landscape will change as the life on the landscape changes. There's the first year, the grasses. Pretty much that's all it. There's a little biochar plant, and they're making some biofuels because plants like switchgrass are very effective sources for biofuels. So we have a number of different economic and ecological pathways for these. This is year 8. Now we've got trees on the landscape. We've taken the coal slurry and we're in the process of cleaning it up. We're producing a lot of biochar on site and biofuels and so on and so forth. And then by year 16, we have a viable economy in place. And it's quite diverse. But the most exciting thing about year 16 is this nodule is seeding and underwriting the restoration of future sites, so that we're creating an expansion over the landscape of these very effective ecologies that includes conservation forests. So we're actually headed back towards at least a semblance of what was once. This is too complicated to describe here. I'm going to summarize it by saying what I've found is that with the ecological succession on the landscape, there is actually a parallel succession institutionally. In fact, I've calculated that there are at least 7 stages of the evolution of the institutions on the land and what they do. This is not one of these, classic ideas of, entrepreneurial or capitalistic versus social and collaborative. This is the idea that at each stage on the landscape, one or other of these approaches is the most effective for the landscape at that time. But at the very end, the goal needs to be to return the land to the people of Appalachia, whose land it was, and who've been helping in this enterprise. So it also involves political institutions, which create a new kind of Homestead Act, and the development of cooperatives that are not just marketing cooperatives and providing services, but are in fact lifelong educational structures that allow people of all ages and all backgrounds to participate in the reemergence of a strong and viable culture. So there are banks, there are universities, there are entrepreneurs, there are various kinds of social organizations. And then the question of ownership is allowed in that model several pathways. So there may be aggregate collective ownership, or there may be individual ownership, but they're not competing with each other, because in a way they're connected through the cooperative structures, at least by the 15th to the 20th year. So I'm beginning to think that there's an institutional ecological succession which very much parallels and can be inspired by the natural world doing the same thing. There's the Sinai Desert, and there is this group based in Holland called the Weathermakers. Marvelous group of engineers, scientists, and just plain good thinkers. They would like to regreen the Sinai back to the cover forest and vegetative cover it had 8,000 years ago. And the reason they want to do that is because they believe that the Sinai is, for better or for worse, depending on circumstances, is a crucible for weather in that part of the world. That in the recent decades, or even centuries, it's getting drier, the temperatures are going up, and its ability to draw moisture into the region, into the Eastern Mediterranean, is diminishing. They investigated the ancient climates when there were trees and vegetation, and found that at that time, and we're talking thousands of years ago, and the records come from Arab traders, that it was able to draw in moisture and the benefits of the monsoons from the Indian Ocean. And it, in fact, helped to nurse lots of North Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, all the way east to India. And then as it became more and more desert, its ability was lost. So the Weathermakers, and I think the next slide shows it, had to find somewhere in the world an example of regreening on a scale that they were thinking about. And the one example they could find through their great friend, John Liu, a biologist, this is the before, 20 years ago, because this Los Plateau was the source of the dust that was choking the cities of China, including Beijing. It was just a massive dust bowl. And the damage it was doing was incredible. And they courageously decided to regreen it. And there it is 20 years later. There's nothing like that on Earth of the scale of that. There's a film by John Liu called Green Gold, which shows this. It's very exciting. The important point was not only were they able to start to regreen, and obviously they carried water and did all kinds of things to get it going, but they also began to develop into the landscape economic elements. And I've heard, although I don't have it confirmed, is that today almost 1 million people are living off the economy created by that ecology on the Los Plateau. Very, very inspirational. Green Gold. Watch it. My contribution to this whole Sinai regreening is one of the things developing an Oasis eco-machine. Now, what we're going to do is to go through a series of 6 slides, which shows how we might take salt water from the nearby ocean, the Mediterranean or the Gulf of Aqaba or the Gulf of Suez, and bring it onto the land and do interesting stuff with the salt water. It's all based on the use of an architectural form, in this case, a geodesic dome. The dome is a greenhouse, and you place it on the desert. Next slide. And there is an example of a dome that's not in the desert, that's closer to home, where the vents are open, which is the way it is during the day. And then at night, the vents are closed, because inside the dome are tanks filled with the seawater. And so during the day, they absorb the heat, and at night, the vents are closed, so it's warm inside, it's cold out in the outer air. And this is an example of the kind of tanks we use. And you can probably see there's fish in those. And inside, in those tanks, is all this aquaculture going on. It's seawater. At night, the vents are closed. Fresh water condenses on the roof of the dome, and the whole dome is pretty much the roof. And then in the morning, the person comes along and drums on it, drums on the structure, and the dome vibrates. And as it vibrates, it rains down fresh water down onto the ground. And so you first of all got the cultivation of valuable foods, seaweeds, fishes, clams, scallops, oysters, microalgae, all those great things. But you're also planting, like we did in Appalachia on the rock, perennial rooted plants who have roots that can get down deeply and relatively quickly. And also the fig tree in the background, which is so much part of the nutritional and the spiritual life of so much of the world. And then over on the tank on the right, you have vine crops like tomatoes and cucumbers growing over and around, because there's enough fresh water now to support them, even though it's seawater in the tank. There's the fig. Figs are ripening there. And then after 5 or 6 years, to be determined, the whole dome is picked up by about 20 people and carried to a new site. And this is what's left behind. The roots way down into the sea, the plants, many of them hardy to deal with salty soils and things like that. And we envision a whole fleet of these things kind of moving across the landscape, leaving these little pods of life behind. And obviously some of these will need to be protected by fencing so that the goats and the sheep don't undo what one has done. It's a technological approach, but it's very tangible in the sense of life and nature and technology are working together toward a predestined beneficial end. Now, this idea, I think we're going to try and do in several places in the world. And one of the places in the United States we're talking about is the Salton Sea. There's a lot of other things planned. What I should end by mentioning is also the Dutch and are creating foundations. One is called Common Lands, and they've already started to train the young people who want to dedicate their lives to regreening the earth, to stabilizing the climate, to sequestering the carbon, and do the whole thing. And there's a plane in Spain, and I don't remember its name right now, where the first of the kind of camp schools has been set up. And then there's another one planned, I think, for South Africa in the fairly near future. And the idea is to train literally thousands and thousands of people. And of course, what I would like to see, and hopefully Healing Earth looks towards, is all these wonderful young people who say, we need to do something to save the planet and it's on our shoulders now. And this would, both the book and these camps become a vehicle to spread the sort of positive mention, the positive feeling that we're not in great shape, but we could sure do something anyway. And who knows, we might even be successful. I'd bet on it if it got going fast and far enough.
So, John, I saw on that slide, and I know that you have a foundation called Ocean Arcs International.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could just give us a few words about that so that people are aware.
Basically, what Ocean Arcs does right now is it publishes Annals of Earth, which comes out 3 times a year. We've been doing it since 1980. Over the years, a lot of the most high-risk projects have been done by the NGO, the not-for-profit. It's a much better model than to have a bunch of investors.
So, John, how can people get involved and support you in the work that you're doing?
I would say start by becoming members of Ocean Arcs International and then take it from there. New structures are going to be formed over the next year or two. And that's why I can't say exactly at this time just how it's going to look.
So is that the best place to track your progress, or?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And you're still doing consulting projects?
Yeah.
And
fewer because I'm what I'm trying to do is to coordinate chapter 16, chapter 15, chapter 14, about 5 or 6 of the chapter projects into one coordinated whole. They've all been operating at this point separately, and to try and put together the talent to make it happen. I think the reason why we're talking a little bit more assertively is because our sense of the need is growing.
Yes, 100%.
You know, can't sit around and say, well, maybe I'll do this, maybe I'll do that.
The time is now. Yeah. And really, that's one of the intentions for this summit is to create a unified voice.
Yeah.
To collectively get people together, and your message is not just a message of hope, but a message of practical action that can reverse the damage we've done if we activate ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for joining us. Keep the momentum going by checking out all the other experts. Every one of them has invaluable information that you can't afford to miss. Buy the Premium Summit package now. Join the global conversation in our Facebook group and take action in your home, community, or the world at large. Together, we will shape a world that works.